tires crunched over gravel as our car slowed to a stop in front of the house. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air seemed to hold its breath, heavy with expectation, as though even the birds had silenced themselves to watch us. It was magnificent in its decay, the house an imposing Victorian, with peaked gables, and ivy climbing up its weathered facade, loomed against a gray sky. To me, it was a promise of something timeless. To Eduardo, my husband, it was a project, another fixer-upper for his endless list of weekend hobbies. To our kids, Lucas and Anna, it was a playground of unexplored corners. "This is it," Eduardo announced, with a forced cheer breaking the quiet. "Home sweet home." I stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The scent of damp wood and old leaves clung to the air. My gaze traveled over the peeling paint and cracked windows, each imperfection telling a story I was desperate to uncover. As we unloaded boxes, I couldn't help but notice how the shadows pooled strangely around the house. It might have been the overcast sky, but there was something odd in how the light bent around certain corners as though reluctant to touch them. Inside, the air was cool, almost too cool, and carried a faint mustiness, like pages of an old book left untouched for years. The rooms were cavernous, with ceilings that stretched high above us, their plaster intricately carved, but worn with age. Each creak of the floorboards under our feet echoed with an unfamiliarity that made the house feel alive. And then we found it, the locked door. "Looks like someone didn't want us in there?" Eduardo joked, jiggling the brass handle. It didn't budge. "It's probably just storage," I offered, but even as I said it, unease prickled at the back of my neck. Lucas crouched down to peer at the keyhole. "Maybe there's treasure in there," he said, his grin mischievous. Anna, quiet as always, simply stood back, her wide eyes fixed on the door. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of unpacking and reorganizing, though I couldn't stop myself from glancing at that door every so often. Its presence was a silent sentinel, a reminder that we didn't fully own this house. Not yet. That night, after we had settled into our rooms, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and groaned, with the kind of sounds you'd expect from something this old. I told myself it was nothing, but just as I began to drift off, a soft sound floated through the stillness. Footsteps. Light, deliberate, and far too close to the locked door. The next morning, I tried to dismiss the footsteps as nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination or the house settling, but the feeling of unease lingered. The children were already exploring before Eduardo and I had finished breakfast. Lucas darted from room to room, announcing each discovery like a tour guide, while Anna followed him quietly. She clung to one of her old dolls, clutching it with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Mom!" Lucas yelled from upstairs. "There's a loose board in the hallway. I think there's something under it." "Careful," I called back. My words were met with the thudding of his footsteps running down the stairs. "It's probably just wiring or insulation," I said more to myself than anyone else, though I couldn't help but feel a tug of curiosity. Eduardo and I spent the day unpacking, but every so often, strange things pulled my attention. A door creaked open by itself, though there was no draft. A picture frame we'd hung in the hallway slipped off the nail, clattering to the floor. Eduardo shrugged it off. "Houses like this have quirks," he said, but by the afternoon, even he couldn't ignore Anna's odd behavior. She had started sitting at the base of the locked door upstairs, whispering to her doll. When Eduardo asked her what she was doing, She simply looked at him and said, "Listening." That night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself standing in front of the door, staring at it. It felt heavier now, more oppressive, as though it were aware of my presence. When I reached out to touch the doorknob, the metal was icy cold against my fingers. "Mariana," Eduardo called from behind me, startling me out of my trance. "Come to bed." I nodded, stepping away, but I could feel its pull even as I descended the stairs. Later that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't soft. They were deliberate and heavy, pacing back and forth in the hallway above our bedroom. Eduardo sat up beside me. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, holding my breath. The pacing stopped abruptly. A second later, a loud thud shook the house, as if something had fallen against the locked door. The following day, the tension in the house was palpable. Eduardo tried to brush off the noises from the night before, insisting it was likely an animal in the attic, but I could see the unease in his eyes, even as he smiled at the kids over breakfast. I decided to busy myself with unpacking, hoping the activity would distract me. It didn't take long for Lucas to disrupt my plans. "Mom, I swear I heard laughing," he said, his voice urgent as he tugged on my arm. "Where?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "By the door," he replied, his eyes wide. "The locked one." Anna, who had been sitting quietly at the table, looked up and added, "He's not laughing. He's mad." My heart stopped. "Who's mad, Anna?" She shrugged, her little hands clutching her doll tighter. "The boy in the room." I exchanged a glance with Eduardo, who furrowed his brow. "Anna, sweetie," he began, kneeling beside her. "There's no boy in the room. It's just an old door." She looked at him with an eerie calm. "He doesn't like you." The rest of the day passed in an anxious haze. Every time I passed the door, I felt its presence, almost like it was watching me. I caught Lucas staring at it too, a mix of curiosity and fear on his face. That night I barely slept. When the footsteps started again, Eduardo and I sat up in bed, listening. This time, they didn't pace. They stopped directly in front of our bedroom door. "Did you lock it?" Eduardo whispered. I shook my head, terrified to even move. We waited in silence, but the sound never came closer. Eventually, the weight of exhaustion pulled us under, though my sleep was restless and filled with dreams of shadows and whispers. The next morning, I went to check on the kids. Lucas was already up, playing in his room, but Anna's bed was empty. Panic set in as I searched the house. Calling her name, I found her upstairs, sitting cross-legged in front of the locked door. "Anna!" I exclaimed, rushing to her. She turned slowly to look at me, her expression blank. "He's sad," she said softly. "He says you need to let him out." Something cold crawled up my spine. "Who told you that?" She pointed at the door. I picked her up, my hands trembling, and carried her downstairs. Whatever was behind that door wasn't staying locked out of coincidence. By the time the kids were in bed that night, I knew I couldn't ignore the door any longer. Something about it gnawed at me, a relentless itch in the back of my mind. Whatever was behind it wasn't going to let us live peacefully in this house. "I'm going to the library tomorrow," I told Eduardo as we lay in bed. "I need to find out who lived here before us." He sighed, rolling onto his side. "Mariana, it's just a door. We're letting it get into our heads." But it wasn't just the door. It was the footsteps, the whispers, the way Anna had started humming lullabies she couldn't possibly know. The next morning, As Eduardo left for work and the kids played in the yard, I drove to the library in town. It was a small, unassuming building with shelves of dusty records and town history books. Looking for something specific? The librarian asked, peering over her glasses. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The house on Elmwood Street, the old Victorian. Do you have anything about its previous owners? She pursed her lips, her expression sharpening with recognition. That house? People don't usually stay there long. Her words sent a chill through me. She retrieved a thick ledger and placed it on the counter. This has property records. You might find what you're looking for in here. I flipped through the pages, my fingers trembling slightly. Then I saw it. The Caldwell family. They lived there decades ago. According to the notes, they had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving the house abandoned for years. But it was the name of their son, Elias Caldwell, that stopped me cold. The notation beside it read, "Deceased, age 8, cause of death, unknown." The librarian must have seen my face pale, because she leaned in closer. "There's more," she said softly. "People say the boy was troubled. His parents kept him locked in one of the rooms, upstairs. Locked in a room." My breath caught. Back at the house, Lucas greeted me at the door with a discovery of his own. "Look what I found," he said, holding up a rusted old key. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The attic," he replied, frowning. "I think it's for the door upstairs." I felt a sinking dread. "Lucas, you didn't try it, did you?" He shook his head, but his curiosity was palpable. I tucked the key away, determined to keep it out of reach. That night, as I stared at the locked door, Elias's name echoed in my mind. The boy in the room. The house felt heavier that night, like it was breathing around us. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, hoping to push the thoughts of Elias and the key out of my mind. But the air seemed charged, as if the house was waiting. Lucas and Anna went to bed early, and Eduardo buried himself in his work downstairs. I took the key from the drawer where I had hidden it and turned it over in my hand. It was small, ancient, and cold as ice. "Maybe I should just see what's inside," I muttered to myself, but the thought of opening that door alone made my stomach twist. I returned the key to the drawer, determined to forget it, but the decision wasn't mine to make. The house was silent when I went upstairs to check on the kids, but as I approached the hallway, a soft click echoed. In the stillness, my heart raced. The door was open. I froze. It had been locked just moments ago. The hallway seemed darker, the air colder. I stepped closer, each movement hesitant, my breath catching with every creak of the floorboards. "Lucas?" I called softly. I pushed the door wider and found Lucas standing in the middle of the room. His back was to me, his small frame rigid. "Lucas, what are you doing in here?" I demanded, rushing to him. He didn't turn. "I didn't open it, Mom. It just opened." His voice was hollow, distant. The room itself was unnerving. Everything inside was perfectly preserved, like a time capsule. A small bed with a faded quilt, wooden toys neatly arranged on shelves, and a child's desk covered in papers yellowed with age. A single window let in a dim shaft of moonlight. Then I saw the marks on the walls. Deep scratches gouged into the wood near the bed, as though someone had clawed at them in desperation. Lucas turned to me, his face pale. He doesn't want to stay in here anymore. A chill ran through me. Who doesn't? Before he could answer, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I grabbed Lucas and pulled him toward the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. Panic clawed at my chest. "Let us out!" I yelled, pounding on the wood. The air in the room thickened, and a low, guttural whisper began to fill the space. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was suffocating. "Mom, look!" Lucas shouted, pointing to the desk. The papers on it had begun to move, lifted by an invisible force. One floated toward us, stopping midair before dropping to the floor. I grabbed it with trembling hands. The words were scrawled in uneven, childish handwriting. "Help me." Suddenly, the door flew open. The pressure in the room lifted, and I didn't waste a second dragging Lucas out. I slammed the door behind us, my heart racing as I locked it with the key. "Go to your room," I ordered him, my voice shaking. "Now." I stood in the hallway for a long time after he left, staring at the door. It seemed to pulse, as though something alive was pressing against it. I realized then that whatever was in that room didn't just want freedom. It wanted us. The next morning, I felt the weight of the previous night pressing on me like a storm cloud. I avoided the door, the hallway, the entire upper floor as much as I could. But the memory of that room, its whispers, the scratches, the desperate note, haunted me. Lucas was subdued at breakfast, barely touching his food. Anna, on the other hand, hummed softly as she played with her doll, the same haunting melody I'd heard the night before. Eduardo noticed my unease. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, his tone laced with concern. "I didn't," I admitted. "The door opened last night. Lucas was inside." His fork clattered against his plate. "What? How did he get in?" "It opened on its own," I said, the words heavy on my tongue. Eduardo pinched the bridge of his nose. "This is getting out of hand. Maybe we should—" But his voice was drowned out by the sound of Anna singing. She rocked her doll gently, her voice eerily sweet. "Where did you learn that?" Eduardo asked, his voice tight. Anna looked up at him, smiling faintly. The boy sang it to me. I couldn't stay silent anymore. "Eduardo, there's something wrong with this house. I went to the library yesterday, and I found records about the family who lived here before us. Their son, Elias, he died in that room." His expression hardened. "Mariana, it's just an old house, with creaks and drafts. You're letting this get to you." But I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. That afternoon, while Eduardo tried to distract himself with work in the garage, I went back to the library. I needed more answers. The librarian recognized me instantly and seemed reluctant to help. "You shouldn't go digging too deep," she warned. "Some places hold on to their pain." But I insisted. She eventually brought me to the archives, where I found old police reports and letters. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. Elias Caldwell hadn't simply died. He had been locked in that room for weeks by his parents, who believed he was possessed. The reports described strange incidents, objects flying across the room, violent outbursts, voices coming from nowhere. Elias had scratched at the walls and screamed to be let out, but when his parents finally opened the door, they found him dead. The file didn't say how he died, only that his body was cold, and the room itself was unnaturally frigid. I left the library with a knot of dread in my stomach. Back at home, I found Eduardo in the living room. I told him everything. "We need to leave," I said. Before he could respond, a sudden thud echoed through the house, followed by Anna's voice, calling from upstairs. "He's mad again," she said softly. "You shouldn't have locked the door." Anna's words hung in the air, chilling me to the bone. Eduardo bolted upstairs, and I followed close behind. We found Anna standing in the hallway, her little doll limp in her hands. She stared at the locked door, her face blank, but her voice trembling. "He doesn't want to be in there anymore," she whispered. "Eduardo, knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Anna, who are you talking about? There's no one in there." She tilted her head, looking past him to the door. "He's right there." The cold air hit me before I even noticed the door trembling. The sound was subtle at first, like a low vibration, but it quickly grew louder, a deep, resonant thudding, as though something on the other side wanted out. "Get her downstairs," I said, my voice shaking. Eduardo hesitated, but the look in my eyes must have convinced him. He scooped Anna into his arms and headed for the stairs. Lucas appeared at the top step, wide-eyed and frozen in place. "Mom," he called, his voice quivering. "Stay with your sister," I commanded, pushing him toward Eduardo. When I turned back to the door, the thudding had stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. My hands shook as I reached for the key in my pocket. I didn't want to open the door, but I knew I couldn't leave it like this. Whatever was in that room wasn't going to stop until we confronted it. The key slid into the lock with an almost mechanical click. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the same pristine room I'd seen before, but this time it felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the dim light filtering through the window seemed wrong. Too cold, too gray. And then I saw him. He was no longer a child. The figure standing by the bed was tall and shadowy, his features obscured by a swirling darkness that seemed to seep from his very being. His presence filled the room, pressing against my chest and stealing the breath from my lungs. "You locked me away," a voice whispered, though it didn't come from his mouth. It echoed around the room, low and venomous. "No," I stammered. "It wasn't me. I didn't—" The figure moved closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a living thing. The walls began to tremble, the scratches deepening with every second. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. "Why won't you help me?" The voice hissed, and suddenly the room erupted. The bed lifted off the ground, slamming against the wall. The toys scattered across the floor, spinning wildly. "I'm trying," I screamed, clutching the door frame as the room seemed to collapse inward. "What do you want?" The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering my question. Then it pointed toward the desk. I scrambled to the papers, my fingers trembling as I shuffled through them. One caught my eye, a child's drawing, crude and jagged. It showed a small figure locked behind bars, a larger figure looming over it. Scrawled across the bottom in bold, uneven letters were the words, "Let him out." The walls groaned, and I realized with sudden clarity what needed to be done. The room wasn't just holding Elias. It was feeding on him, trapping his torment and amplifying it. I reached into my pocket for the matches I'd brought from the kitchen. The room seemed to sense my intent, the shadows growing darker and more frantic. "I'm sorry," I whispered, striking the match. Flames licked at the papers. The desk, the bed, the figure shrieked. A sound so inhuman, it felt like it would split my skull. I staggered backward, choking on the smoke, and fumbled for the door. As I stumbled out into the hallway, the fire roared behind me. Eduardo was there, grabbing my arm and dragging me downstairs. The kids were already outside, watching as the flames consumed the upper floor of the house. But as we stood there, watching the fire spread, I saw it. In the window of the burning room, a shadow lingered, watching, waiting. The fire gutted the upper floor, leaving the house a blackened skeleton of what it once was. By the time the fire department arrived, there wasn't much left to save. We stood in the cold night air, the acrid smell of smoke clinging to our clothes, watching the last embers flicker and die. Eduardo wrapped his arms around Anna and Lucas, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. I stood apart, staring at the charred remains of the house. I should have felt triumphant, but all I could feel was emptiness. "Is it over?" Eduardo asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence. I wanted to say yes, but the words wouldn't come. The firefighters gave us a place to stay for the night, a small hotel in town. The kids fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I did, I saw the shadow in the window, its form shifting and watching me as the flames rose. In the morning, Eduardo was already on the phone with the insurance company, making arrangements to leave the town and never come back. I should have felt relief, but a nagging thought stayed with me. It wasn't gone. On the drive out of town, Anna sat quietly in the back seat, her doll resting in her lap. She hadn't said much since the fire, but as we passed the outskirts of the town, she turned to look out the window. "He's still there," she said softly. Eduardo and I exchanged a glance. "What did you say, sweetie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Anna looked at me, her expression unreadable. "The boy. He's still in the room. He doesn't want to stay, but he can't leave." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles whitening. "Anna, it's just your imagination," I said, though my voice trembled. She didn't reply. She only hummed the same haunting melody as the car rolled further away from the ruined house. Even now, weeks later, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced. I hear footsteps outside my door. The fire may have destroyed the house, but I know the shadow of Elias Caldwell, and whatever held him captive still lingers. Still,